Hey friends, so this should be the seventh video lecture on the topic of lifespan development. It should be the seventh and the last. I don't know if in the previous video lecture you saw when my computer popped up, my battery was dying or not. So I apologize for that abrupt transition. But it actually works out okay because this is not really a topic I wanted to fly through really fast. So like I mentioned, in the context of lifespan development, we usually think of, or it's broken down into cognitive, social, emotional. So this slide is about some of the big picture things that happen during adulthood social development. The one that I was talking about is this myth of the midlife crisis. So the assumption is that we get to this stage of midlife and we go, oh my gosh, what's happening to my life? This isn't how it all was supposed to be. There is, in fact, the idea of this existential crisis. I think that's Carl Jung, and he argued that there are two times in life where we have an existential crisis, where we ask ourselves, like, what's the meaning of life? What's all this about, right? And the first one of those would be right shortly around graduating from high school. Maybe some of you are going through that right now. And the next one would be the midlife, so about my age, about 45, 50, where we say, oh, this isn't how I thought it was supposed to be. And developmental psychologists argue that this is a period of examination. This is a period of transition, for a lot of reasons, but it's not necessarily, and it need not be, a period of crisis. But because this is a stage of life where our children may be moving out, our friends begin to die, we may be mid-career, it is a logical time, or it is normal to go through this midlife transition period. But it really, but the notion that this is always a bad thing, and people trade in their older spouses for a younger one, or get a sports car, that is in fact a myth. Social clock. I forget what it means by social clock. I think social clock refers to that there are certain things that happen. I think that's what it means. There are certain things that happen at different stages in our life course that are kind of predictable. And when you get to 45, 50, one of those predictable things is your children graduate high school and they go to college. One of the things that I am very sensitive to is that when my mother was 50 years old, she had a grandchild who was 5 years old. And when my father was a year older than me, he died. So while on one hand, I would love to have some grandbabies, and I feel like I'm kind of behind in that regard. On the other hand, I don't really want to be the same place my father was when he was my age. Sandwich generation. This is a really important term. I actually talk about sandwich generation in all of my classes, my marriage and family, my sociology class, all of them. The sandwich generation refers to the generation that is in between caring for their children and caring for their parents. So I am sandwich generation. Even though my children are adults, my mother is 75, I am still I still have psychological and emotional demands that are downward, in other words, younger generation, and psychological demands that are upward towards an adult generation. In my other class, I make reference to a time when my mother was living with us and she was upset with me, and she was standing at the top of the stairs and crying, and I turned around, and my daughter, who I think was 9 or 10 at the time, was standing behind me also crying, right? So that's also sandwich generation, but that's because I am the sandwich generation. I'm the one that, you have responsibilities going both directions, and sometimes that can be hard to manage. Sometimes it can be very stressful. This is so Erickson, and we haven't talked a whole lot about Erickson, but he is another developmental psychologist, and what he argued that this time in adult life, that adulthood, he called them crises, but one of the things that adults go through, or must deal with, is this period of what he called intimacy and that word right there. That this is a time, and I think Freud used the language of love and work. So adulthood is when our energies are devoted to intimate relationships and creating something for the future. That's what generativity means. It means love and work. So we are not really investing in ourselves during adulthood, but we are committed in caring relationships, intimate relationships, and we're trying to create something for the future generativity. Interestingly, one of the things that happens, one of the myths, and again, if I was in my marriage and family class, we talk a lot about this, is about marital satisfaction. Is, when your marital satisfaction when kids come along, actually plummets. And when kids leave home, it begins to decline. The lowest, this is interesting, the lowest point of marital satisfaction when married couples are the most unhappy with family life is when their children are teenagers. So we get married, marital satisfaction is high, babies come, we have this significant drop because there's less time to spend on each other. Kids become teenagers, marital satisfaction goes down even more, and then kids leave home and marital satisfaction goes up. So if couples can hang on, if they can hang on till those kids leave home, and in some cases, because they have been so unhappy, or maybe they have been abusive, they may divorce when kids leave home because they literally were staying together for the sake of the children. And that's when we talk about divorce. Interesting statistic, though, is that we have this sort of cultural notion that suicide is highest amongst teenagers, but in fact, suicide is actually highest amongst middle-aged to old men. 60, I forget, it's in your textbook. Men over the age of 50, I believe it is, are at the highest risk of suicide. All right, so picking up where I left off, I was talking about divorce and marital satisfaction over time and suicide, and how it's actually middle-aged men who have the highest, or at the greatest, have the higher suicide rates. And I suppose one could argue that this may be attributed to that midlife transition, but especially that would be true with men whose marriages are no longer intact and their children leave home. Men unfortunately are in a culture where they are intimate emotional connections with other men are discouraged, and so women have other relationships beyond their marital relationship. Very often, for a middle-aged man, the only friend he really has is his wife and his children. And if that relationship goes sour, he may have no one else. Okay, and then the last stage of the life course, of course, is death and dying. Which is not really a stage as much as it is a process, right? Dying is it's not a sudden thing, but there's this whole process of death. There's this period towards, if you listen to anybody talk about the Queen, they'll talk about in the last couple of months that she declined quite quickly. That's actually called the terminal drop. That's a very normal, common phenomena and that's, if you're a close observer of death and dying, you would probably notice that and would probably recognize that the end is very near because of this terminal decline. A couple things that happen towards the end of people's lives as they get older. I think I mentioned that one already. The amygdala becomes less responsive. A really important theory is this one, the socio-emotional selective hypothesis. And I see this a lot with my mother, but this is a phenomena where older people they're more particular about who they spend time with, so they're selective, and they're selective in their relationships based on the emotional return. Basically, they're tired of putting up with everybody's crap, and if a relationship is not rewarding or meaningful, they don't participate, they don't do things they don't want to do anymore. Their time is limited. Death with dignity. So death with dignity, this is a fancy way of saying, and we have end of life advocates that argue that people should have control over how they die. This kind of starts to get into some potentially religious things. There's maybe even some overlap with reproductive freedom notion, but the idea that it's my body, I should be able to spend the last few days how I want. And so death with dignity is that I have control over the last processes, that I'm not People don't, I'm not forced to stay alive. I'm not forced to have interventions that I don't want to have. Despair versus integrity is an Erickson stage of the end of life in which the person examines their life and decides if it has been a life of integrity. Have they lived a meaningful life? Do they have meaningful relationships? Have they contributed to society, or do they look back on their life with sort of despair and regret? Sometimes there's a phenomenon called life review, and this is a process that you see old people doing. I hear my mom talking about her life review, where you look back through, you reflect on the things that you've done and the relationships you've had, and you decide if it's been a life of integrity. And interesting, when we were talking earlier in this chapter about how some of the characteristics early in our life are consistent across time, we see that personality traits, particularly going back to infancy, when we were talking about temperament, people who are easy to calm, who are emotionally reactive, babies that were easy to calm down. One of the things that we see even at the end of life is these temperamental traits remain stable over time. If you are a kind of an easygoing, if you were an easygoing baby, the odds that you will be an easygoing old person are higher than if you were a colicky baby. If you were flexible when you were a teenager, the odds that you will be a flexible adult or a flexible older person are sort of remain consistent. To some degree, I think that what we see at the end of life is sort of the essence of who a person is. Sort of all that other stuff gets weeded out. All right. Well, this kind of wraps up the last topic on the chapter of lifespan development. Think about, yeah. I guess that's all. I'll leave it here, and thank you for listening.